Okay, so, this deep dive is going to be a little bit different. You guys, the listeners, you sent over some really, really interesting stuff that kind of makes you think about the universe. Like the really big picture stuff and where we fit into it all. Especially this one episode really stuck with me.
Yeah, this episode, it really brings up some pretty big ideas. And honestly, when you start thinking about them, it can really change how you see the world?
Totally. I mean, the main thing I keep coming back to after reading this episode is like, what even is meaning? Like what does it even mean when it seems like the whole universe is just heading towards like randomness?
It's a big question. And that's basically the whole point of this episode, right? It's saying that all the meaning we humans create, it could all just be like a little blip of order in this huge ocean of chaos.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And this whole idea of entropy keeps coming up too. Like the universe just wants to unwind and get messier.
Right, exactly. Entropy is basically a way of measuring how random or disordered things are. It's just the natural way of things, for things to become less organized over time.
So like my desk, that's entropy in action.
Pretty much, yeah. Unless you keep putting energy into organizing it, it'll just naturally get messier. Think about this. Imagine a hot cup of coffee just sitting there. It cools down, right? The heat spreads out into the room.
Right, doesn't just stay hot forever.
Yeah. So the heat energy becomes more spread out, more disordered. That's entropy increasing. Or think about like a sandcastle on the beach.
Okay, yeah.
Someone puts in a lot of work to build it all nice and neat, but the wind and the waves will eventually knock it down, turn it back into a jumbled pile of sand.
Right, back to randomness. And this episode takes it even further. Like galaxies spreading apart, everything cooling down. Heat death, they call it.
That's a pretty wild thought, right? And it all comes down to this thing called the second law of thermodynamics. It's this fundamental rule that says entropy in a closed system, like the universe as a whole can only increase or stay the same. It never decreases on its own.
So everything we do, like building cities, making art, even just cleaning up, it's all like this tiny little fight against this universal tendency to just fall apart. I like how this episode called it an anti-entropy thing.
That's a good way to think about it, yeah.
Okay, so we've got this universe that's always trying to get messier. Now let's talk about meaning. Like, where does meaning even come from in all this chaos? The episode seems to suggest that it's actually tied to this whole need for order.
Exactly. It's like for life to exist, it has to create order. And this episode argues that creating meaning is how we do that, at least in our minds. It's a way to survive.
Right, because if everything is random, how do you even know what to do?
Right. Exactly. So even a simple bacteria, it needs to figure out where the food is and what to avoid. That's already a basic form of creating meaning. This episode calls life itself a process of local entropy reduction.
Huh, that's interesting. So even just staying alive, keeping yourself organized, that's like fighting entropy, right?
Exactly. We take in energy, we build structure, we basically resist falling apart. And this episode says that, like, the way we create meaning is kind of like a mental version of that. It's about taking all this random information coming at us and trying to organize it in a way that makes sense.
So when we say something is meaningful, what we're really doing is creating a little pocket of order in our minds. Like this episode talked about low-entropy islands in a chaotic universe. That's a cool image.
Yeah, it is. It's like building a little haven of predictability and stability where things make sense, even if the universe around us is constantly changing.
But isn't that kind of an illusion, though?
Well, in a way, yeah, because no matter how much order we create, eventually entropy always wins.
Right, right. It's like those sandcastles doomed to be washed away. But okay, let's break down this meaning as order thing with some examples, because this episode had some good ones. Starting with like the most basic animal instincts.
Right, so imagine like a squirrel, right? It learns that a certain smell means there's food nearby. That's super basic, but it's still a way of creating meaning. It's taking random sensory input and turning it into something useful and predictable.
Right, the smell becomes meaningful because it's connected to something important, survival.
Exactly. It's reducing the randomness, the uncertainty. The squirrel's not just sniffing around randomly anymore. It knows what to look for.
And then this episode jumps to like early humans and how they use symbolism and stuff like thunder gods, spirits in the trees.
Oh, yeah, that's a great example. Like, imagine you're an early human and you have no idea why there's this loud booming in the sky, right? It's terrifying. So you create a story, a myth about a thunder god.
Right. Suddenly it's not just random scary noise. There's a reason behind it, a powerful being controlling it.
Exactly, and that gives you some sense of control, some way to understand, and maybe even appease this force. It brings order to the chaos, even if it's not scientifically accurate.
So meaning, even if it's based on a myth, can still help us feel less afraid, less overwhelmed by the randomness. And then, of course, there's language. That's got to be like the ultimate meaning-making tool.
Absolutely. Language is all about taking random sounds and turning them into symbols that have shared, stable meanings. It's like before language, you'd have to point and grunt and hope the other person gets what you're trying to say.
Right, so inefficient.
Totally. But with language, we can communicate complex ideas with incredible precision. It's like we built this whole system for reducing the randomness in communication.
And then there's culture, right? The shared stories, the rules, the traditions of a society.
Yeah. Culture is super important for creating order and predictability in how we interact with each other. It gives us a shared framework for behavior, so we know what's expected of us, what's acceptable, what's not.
So it's like these unspoken rules that help us navigate social situations without everything just descending into chaos. And then, of course, there's science. This episode called it Humanity's Most Ambitious Effort to Create Order and Meaning.
Absolutely. Science is all about trying to find the underlying patterns and laws that govern the universe. It's about taking all this complexity and trying to boil it down to a few simple, elegant explanations.
It's like taking this giant, messy puzzle and figuring out how all the pieces fit together. And it's always evolving too, right?
Right. New discoveries can change everything we thought we knew. But that's part of what makes it so exciting. It's this ongoing quest for knowledge, this constant refinement of our understanding.
It's like building a better and better map of reality, even though we know the territory might change.
Yeah. And speaking of maps, maps are a great example of this whole entropy reduction thing. We take a complex three-dimensional world and represent it in a simplified two-dimensional way, making it easier to understand and navigate. It's all about creating order out of chaos.
Right. A map is way more useful than just wandering around randomly.
Exactly. It gives us a sense of direction, a way to find what we're looking for.
And then there's personal meaning, like our individual goals, values, the stuff that makes our lives feel important to us.
That's crucial, right? It gives us direction, motivation, a sense of purpose. Like, why do we get out of bed in the morning? What are we striving for? What makes life worth living? These are all questions about personal meaning.
And those answers could be so different for everyone. But this episode seems to suggest that no matter what our personal meaning is, it's still about creating order in our own lives.
It is. It's about figuring out what matters to us and then organizing our actions around those values, like raising a family, building a career, making art, whatever it is that gives us a sense of purpose.
It's like building our own personal low-entropy island in the midst of all the chaos. So from a single-celled organism to a whole civilization, this whole idea of creating meaning seems to be about trying to fight back against the universe's natural tendency to just fall apart.
Yeah, that's a great way to summarize it. And that leads to this idea of civilization as like a massive shared meaning-making project.
Right. It's not just a bunch of people living together. It's like we're all working together to build these even bigger, more complex systems of order and meaning.
Exactly. Think of it like this. If an individual creates a low-entropy island by finding personal meaning, then civilization is like building an entire archipelago of these islands, all connected and supporting each other.
So we've got all these examples, right? Religion, laws, science, they're all ways of creating these larger scale structures of meaning and order.
Absolutely. Like religion, it tries to answer the big questions about life and death, right? It gives us a shared framework for understanding our place in the universe, a set of moral guidelines for how to live.
Right. It provides a sense of belonging, of shared purpose. It creates order out of the existential chaos of just existing, right?
Exactly. And then there are laws and social rules. Those are all about creating a predictable and stable society. It's about agreeing on what's right and wrong, what's acceptable behavior, and how to resolve conflicts peacefully.
Like without laws, it'd be a free-for-all, right? Everyone just doing whatever they want.
Ho chaos. But laws create a structure, a framework that allows us to live together in relative peace and harmony. And then scientific civilization, that's like our collective effort to understand the universe. We pool our knowledge, we develop technologies, we build institutions dedicated to research and discovery.
It's amazing, really. It's like this giant collaborative project where we're constantly pushing the boundaries of knowledge and understanding. But here's the thing that kind of blew my mind, and this episode really emphasizes this. All these systems we create, all this order we build, it's not permanent.
Yeah, this episode really brings that home, doesn't it?
It does. It's kind of like all that effort, all that striving, and in the end, it all fades away.
Yeah, this episode reminds us that everything is temporary. Even the most impressive civilizations eventually crumble. The ideas that once seemed unshakable eventually get revised or replaced. Even the stars themselves eventually burn out.
It's kind of a humbling thought, right? That nothing we create lasts forever.
It is, but it's also a reminder to appreciate the beauty and the fragility of the thing that we build and the meaning we create while they last.
And that brings us to what this episode called the paradox of meaning. It's like this tension between our deep need for meaning and the realization that it's all temporary.
It's a big one. We craved stability, purpose, something that gives our lives significance, but we live in a universe where everything is constantly changing, everything is ultimately impermanent.
So it's like we're constantly building these sandcastles, knowing the tide's going to come in and wash them away.
It's a beautiful analogy, right? Because even though we know they're not permanent, we still pour our hearts into building them. We still find joy and satisfaction in the process.
And maybe that's the point, right? The meaning isn't in the permanence, but in the creation, the experience, the shared effort.
I think so. It's like those fireworks this episode talked about. They're fleeting, they disappear in an instant, but they're still breathtaking. They still fill us with awe and wonder.
Yeah, the beauty is in the moment, not in the lastingness. So what happens when we really understand this idea? Like that meaning is this thing we create in our minds, that it's not some objective truth out there in the universe. Does that change how we live our lives?
I think it can. Maybe instead of chasing after some ultimate eternal meaning, we start focusing on appreciating the meaning we create in each moment.
Like being grateful for the relationships we have, the beauty we experience, the small acts of kindness we share with others.
Exactly. Recognizing that it's all temporary might actually make us cherish those things even more.
So maybe this episode is less about saying that meaning is an illusion and more about saying that we have the power to create it, even in a universe that's ultimately indifferent to our existence.
I think that's a great way to put it, and maybe that's a more empowering perspective, right? It means we're not just passive observers in a meaningless universe, but active participants in creating the meaning we want to see.
So to wrap up this deep dive into this really thought-provoking episode, the big takeaway is that meaning is not some cosmic truth we discover. It's something we build. It's a local, temporary reduction of entropy in a universe that's constantly moving towards more and more disorder.
Yeah, that's the core idea. We're all just these little pockets of order in a vast sea of chaos, creating our own little flippers of light in the darkness.
And that leaves us with a final thought, something for you, our listener, to think about. If all the meaning we create is ultimately temporary, what kinds of low-entropy islands do you want to build in your own life? What matters to you? What do you want to contribute to the world? How do you want to spend your precious time here? Because even though it's all fleeting, it's still incredibly beautiful and meaningful. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a great discussion. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for listening.